Okay, today we're going to talk about water quality. Water quality is the health of the water based on the requirements of the organisms that live in it. And what that means is that there's no one specific body of water that every single aquatic organism on Earth could live in, because all of those different organisms are adapted to specific parts of the world. So if you take a cold water fish like a salmon and put it in the tropics, even if it's the most pristine water out there, that salmon is going to die because it needs cold water. The water would be too warm for it. The same thing happens when you're talking about freshwater fish and saltwater fish. You can't take a saltwater fish and put it into freshwater and expect it to live, because its body doesn't know how to handle that lack of salt in the water. So water quality doesn't always mean that it's dirty or anything like that. It means that there's certain things that the organisms in that water have to have in order to survive, and that's what makes it healthy or not. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can measure water quality. The first one that we're going to talk about is temperature. And when we talk about temperature, remember the specific heat of water is very high. Therefore, it takes a long time for it to heat up. It also takes a long time for it to cool down, because it takes a lot of energy to do both of those. So it also depends on how much water you have. The more water you have, the longer it's going to take. So shallow water tends to be a whole lot closer to the temperature of its surroundings than a large body of water, because there's not nearly as much water there. So if you have a pond that's in the sun, it's going to be a whole lot warmer than a pond that's about the same size in the shade. The other thing that you have to think about is something called thermal pollution. And what happens here is that factories and power plants will take water in and use it to cool off the machines and whatever else is in there, is in the building, so that they don't overheat. And what happens is they pump the water around the machines, and the water never actually touches the machines, but as it goes past, it warms up a lot and it takes the heat away from the machines. So when they pump it back out, it's still completely clean as far as there's no pollutants in it, but it's a whole lot warmer, and that affects the organisms that live in there. The next way we can measure water quality is something called turbidity. That's just how cloudy or hazy the water is. So the more turbid it is, the more stuff there is floating in the water. And that stuff that can be floating can be anything from clay, silt, algae, other microscopic organisms that live there. It can be a lot of different things. And there's several issues that go along with that. The first is that the more turbidity you have, the less photosynthesis you're going to have, because the more stuff you have floating in the water, the more light it's going to block out, and that's not going to get to the plants, so the plants can't go through photosynthesis as well. The next thing that it does is it provides a place for pollutants like toxic metals or pesticides or things like that that have been put into the water. It provides a place for them to attach, so they don't go anywhere. They stay in that water, so it becomes more polluted. And the last thing that it does, it provides a place for waterborne pathogens to thrive. So it provides food and shelter for for waterborne pathogens. And if you have waterborne pathogens that are thriving in a body of water, it's a whole lot more likely that you're going to have an outbreak of that waterborne pathogen. The next way we can measure it is something called dissolved oxygen, or DO. And when we talk about this, we're talking about oxygen gas, which is O2. And what happens is it dissolves in water exactly the same way that carbon dioxide dissolves in carbonated drinks like soda and that kind of thing. So it comes from either the atmosphere or photosynthetic plants in the water. Remember, photosynthesis is when plants or algae take carbon dioxide and water and convert it into glucose and oxygen. And there's a couple of factors that determine how much dissolved oxygen will be in the water. The first one is whether or not the water is moving. If the water is moving, it tends to have a whole lot less organic material than stagnant water. And stagnant just simply means that it's standing still, like a lake or a pond. So when you have more organic material, there's the bacteria in the water are going to decompose that organic material. And whenever bacteria go through decomposition, they're also going through respiration. And respiration is the complete opposite of photosynthesis. So it's when organisms take oxygen and glucose and convert it into carbon dioxide and water. So anytime there's decomposition going on, you're going to lose some oxygen from the water. The other thing that it does that affects the concentration of dissolved oxygen is temperature. And temperature and dissolved oxygen are inversely related. That means that they're basically the opposite. When one goes up, the other one goes down. So if you increase the temperature, you're going to decrease the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water, and vice versa. If you decrease the temperature, there's going to be more dissolved oxygen. The fourth way that we can measure water quality is nitrogen, the nitrogen level in the water. Nitrogen is essential to every organism on Earth. We need it to make protein. We also need it to make genetic material. So the atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen. But the issue is that nitrogen is in a form that we can't use. It's N2, which is molecular nitrogen. And it's completely useless to almost all organisms on Earth. So, luckily, there is a process called nitrogen fixation. And this is where bacteria convert the molecular nitrogen, N2, into forms that plants can use. And there's a whole cycle that goes along with it. Before we get to the cycle, there is one other way that this can happen other than bacteria, and that is lightning. So what can happen is the energy from lightning can cause the nitrogen and water in the atmosphere to react, and they form ammonia and nitrates. And those are the two forms of nitrogen that organisms can use. And then they fall to Earth with precipitation, and then it goes into the nitrogen cycle. But the majority of it comes from nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So this is the nitrogen cycle. And very simply what happens is when you have fish waste and decomposing plant matter in a lake or a river or some body of water, it contains ammonia. Ammonia is a form of nitrogen that's actually toxic to us, but plants or bacteria can take that and they can fix it into nitrates and nitrites, and these are the forms that plants can use. And so what happens is the plants take those up into their roots, and those nitrates and nitrites are actually natural fertilizers. So when you buy fertilizer, it has nitrates and nitrates too, but this is all natural. This is how it happens in nature. So the plants take up the nitrates and the nitrites and use it to build them their body. And plants and other aquatic organisms eat those, or fish and other aquatic organisms eat those plants, and then they either digest it and it leaves them as waste, or they die, or the plants die, and all of that is going to create more ammonia, which then goes back to the bacteria, and the cycle keeps on going. The last way that we can measure water quality is pH. And pH is the measure of how acidic or basic the water is, and it's on a scale from 0 to 14. And when we talk about this scale, 7 is neutral, which means pure water. And you never actually find pure water in nature. It's always got at least something dissolved in it, so it's going to change the pH slightly. So if you have a pH that is below 7, it's going to be an acid. And if you have a pH above 7, it's a base. pH is pretty important because it determines how things will dissolve in water. So it'll determine how nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus and other things that we need and aquatic organisms need are going to dissolve. The other thing that can dissolve in the water is something we don't want, and that is toxic metals. Toxic metals tend to be more soluble and dissolve more easily when the pH is lower. So the more acidic the water is, the higher the concentration of those heavy metals will probably be. And then another thing is that acidic water can irritate fish gills and damage the aquatic organisms directly. So when water passes over a fish's gills, that's how they get the oxygen out of the water, that oxygen that's dissolved. that goes through a membrane. But if the water's too acidic, then those membranes are going to be damaged and the fish won't be able to get oxygen as well. So that's one of the reasons that fish die when the water is too acidic. The last thing about pH and water quality is that when you have carbon dioxide dissolved in the water, it forms carbonic acid. And the issue with that is that if you have carbonic acid forming, then the pH is going down. So the more carbon dioxide you have, the more acidic the water is going to be. So those are all ways that we can measure water quality. So now what do people do that affects water quality? The first thing is something called eutrophication. And eutrophication is when you have an over-enrichment of a body of water by nutrients like nitrates and phosphates. Both nitrates and phosphates are things that aquatic organisms need, but when you have too much of it, it can cause all kinds of problems. So there's 6 steps when it comes to eutrophication. The first one is that somebody adds fertilizer to an area like their yard or a farm or something like that. So the reason that we add fertilizer is to make the plants grow more. So what happens is the fertilizer is applied and then rain causes that fertilizer to run into lakes or ponds. And the fertilizer causes the aquatic plants and algae to grow really, really, really fast. And when those plants and algae grow really fast, they're going to use up resources such as carbon dioxide and space. And then because they use up all of those resources, they're going to begin to die. So initially you end up with a whole bunch more oxygen because they're going through photosynthesis so fast. But then the bacteria come along and start to decompose these dead plants and algae. And when this happens, they use all of the oxygen that's in the water because they're going through respiration really, really fast to decompose all that dead stuff. That means that the oxygen levels are going to drop. And when that happens, all the other organisms in the lake or pond are going to die because there's not enough oxygen left for them. So essentially, what happens is when eutrophication happens is that the body of water essentially dies and very, very little can live in it. The other way that humans really affect water quality is acid rain. So when we put out air pollution, that gets dissolved into the water and the water vapor in the air, and then when it rains, it comes back down to earth. When we have normal rain, it generally has a pH of about 7, but the pH of acid rain is about 5 to 5.5, so it's a whole lot lower and it can cause all kinds of problems. So in order to do as much as we can to prevent both eutrophication and acid rain, the U.S. passed what's called the Clean Water Act. And what that is, it was passed in 1972, and it's basically a way to regulate